Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today in what we hope will be an interesting and informal discussion about the global state of peacefulness today. So my name is Michael Collins. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Economics and Peace, a think tank, a non-profit think tank based out of Sydney, Australia. We're most well known for the Global Peace Index, which is the flagship report that we're going to be discussing today. It kind of sort of aims to provide a broad and holistic picture of peacefulness around the world. So it covers 163 countries. There's a lot to get through. We've tried to cut it down, to only the essentials, but there's a few things that the Global Peace Index doesn't do. And that is largely, way into policy and future planning. We do a few scenarios in something like the Global Peace Index and our broader work and our different forms of consulting. But from a policy perspective, we have a fabulous list of experts joining us today. If you have signed up for this presentation or this webinar, you will have had a chance to see their bios, and we will be opening up to hear their comments about the Global Peace Index and more broadly the geopolitical situation today and everything that entails in a few minutes. But I'd love to be able to run through a very quick round of introductions, starting in this case with Dr. Benjamin Rad.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Benjamin Rad. I am an affiliate at the MIT's Security Study Program Wargaming Lab, a senior fellow at the UCLA Berkeley Center, and a lecturer in law at UCLA Law School and also the USC Gould School of Law.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. And I'd like to follow up with Dr. Paul Stairs, please.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Paul Stairs. I'm a senior fellow for conflict prevention and director of the new Center for Peace and Security, the Wackenheim Center for Peace and Security at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C. Glad to be joining everyone.
Thank you very much, Paul. Handing it over to Mr. Alex Vatanka.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be with you. I look forward to our panel discussion and discussing the report. I'm at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior fellow. I focus mostly on Iran, domestic affairs of the Iranian state, its regional policies, and obviously what Iran is doing internationally, and currently busy working on a book on Iran's Arab strategy, which I'm hoping will be timely for our discussion today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex, and very much look forward to that. And we really look forward to hearing from you as well, all of the audience members. We realize that it's a webinar format, so it's a bit more difficult to interact directly. But we'd really encourage you to be able to add your questions, thoughts, and comments in the Q&A or the chat function. And we'd love to be able to kind of sort of address those questions as and when they come in throughout the presentation today, either while I'm presenting the key findings in the beginning or alternatively during the conversation afterwards. So really the Q&A section in many ways sort of starts now. Please don't hold back on the questions because, beyond the key findings in the presentation, we aim to keep this as dynamic and as interactive as we possibly can. So to set the stage, here we go. I mentioned the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index, we've been producing it. Actually, this is the 20th year of the Global Peace Index. It aims to measure the absence of violence or fear of violence around the world. The ethos of the Institute is that peace has often been defined as something very broad, very marshmallowy, very cloudy, something that can't be measured. So if we wanted to measure peace, at least, an initial state of peace, how is it that we could measure it and what benefit would be gained from it? So there's a few things that you can do. For example, you can look at measures of safety and security around the world, right? We can look at homicide, we can look at violent crime, we can look at demonstrations, we can look at police rates, incarceration. All of those elements are data that exists around the world that we can measure to be able to ascertain whether one country is safer or one country is less safe than the other. The second core aspect here is ongoing conflict, right? What are the wars that are happening around the world? What's the intensity of those wars? What are the casualties of those wars? What's the number of wars that individual countries participate in, for example? And then the third domain in the Global Peace Index is levels of militarization, right? what is the military expenditure, weapons imports, exports, nuclear weapons, heavy weapons capability, etc. And all of these different things can be brought together to be able to measure changes in levels of peacefulness and how different countries compare in peacefulness. Now, it's contentious, more for the people on the bottom of the index than the people on the top. But the premise is this, right? The premise is an entirely peaceful country, be that a fantasy at this point, is a country that has no homicide, no violent crime, no conflict, and no militarization either. It doesn't need an army, it doesn't need police, it doesn't need jails. Now, again, this is a bit of a fantasy, but it does provide a very good baseline for measuring how close we are to that in many ways. It's like a reverse doomsday clock, for lack of a better word. Unfortunately, the Global Peace Index is in the headlines a lot, but primarily about things that are going wrong. So we are going to be seeing quite a bit of emphasis on conflict and some of the major deteriorations that we have seen. In fact, this next slide here is basically the headline numbers for the whole thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of sort of show these up on the screen. We've been seeing a deterioration in peacefulness for quite some time now. 12 years, consecutive deterioration, 15 deteriorations out of the last 18 years. And the expectation, at least on our end, is that, peacefulness is not going to be improving any time soon. 99 countries deteriorated in peacefulness last year. 119 countries are less peaceful today, out of the 163, less peaceful today than they were in 2008. 2008 is actually the most peaceful that we have seen the world, right, since the inception of the Global Peace Index. And that was, considering 2008, that was the Second Gulf War. It was the war on terror in Afghanistan. It was the Russia-Georgia war. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on there. As the Institute for Economics and Peace, we also track the economic impact of violence, which, as you can see here, was $21.8 trillion last year. And this is, again, largely being driven by conflict today. So the economic impact of conflict specifically has tripled since 2008. We look at it regionally and at a country basis. We're going to be delving into that very quickly. But as you can see here on the right-hand side, most, if not all, of the regions around the world have also deteriorated in peacefulness last year. Surprisingly, the only one that actually improved is Eastern Europe and Central Asia. That includes both Ukraine and Russia. And that's largely a data blip in the sense that the situation was so bad in Russia and in Ukraine last year that the slight improvements this year have actually driven a regional improvement. So the Global Peace Index produces a whole ranking of countries, and these are the 10 most peaceful countries in the index this year out of the 163. Most of these countries currently are European for the most part. We don't tend to see major shifts, right? The most peaceful countries tend to remain on the top end of the index. The least peaceful countries tend to remain on the bottom of the index. But there's lots more, right? So, for example, Canada's not in the top 10. That's ranked 14. Uruguay is 45th in South America. Sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritius is 18th in the Global Peace Index. Equatorial Guinea is 38th, although there's a likelihood of deterioration in peacefulness there. In the Middle East, Qatar is the most peaceful country in that particular region. Uzbekistan, 37th in the Global Peace Index. Bhutan, 16th from South Asia. So there's a lot more peaceful countries there. For context, the United States in the Global Peace Index is 134th out of 163 countries and deteriorated 4 places last year. It's a country that's highly militarized. It has relatively high levels of homicide. It's got one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. So overall, there's a number of things that are kind of sort of working against it in something like the Global Peace Index. If we look right at the bottom of the spectrum there, we kind of see these are the 10 least peaceful countries in the Global Peace Index last year. If Russia, largely driven by the conflict in Ukraine. You also see Ukraine here. So hopefully this speaks to the fact that the Global Peace Index is not a moral judgment. What we're saying here is that independently where you stand on, say, Russia and Ukraine, or alternatively Israel, Iran, US, and all of the other wars around the world, These countries are impacted by conflict in that sense, right? So they have a lack of peacefulness. The US's peacefulness score has deteriorated given the war in Iran as much as Iran's score has as well. So it's not a value judgment and it's not sort of pushing fingers, but it's broadly talking about lack of peacefulness. Some big improvements, not many. These were the biggest ones last year. So Poland currently about 22nd. Yeah, exactly 22nd in the Global Peace Index. Gabon is 100th. All three of these top countries here saw political improvements. But just to give some more context, right? Lesotho, the third country that most improved last year. This is the country with the highest homicide rates in the world. So all of this kind of sort of needs to be put into context in many ways. In terms of some of the deteriorations, political instability plays a very big role here, and deteriorations in peacefulness globally in this case. Ongoing socioeconomic issues in Nepal, but this was broadly driven by an attempted ban on social media and the implications that led to the resignation of the prime minister in Nepal. In Chad, a whole bunch of issues there with insurgencies from the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda affiliates. Humanitarian aid has dropped 2/3 in Chad, Republic of the Congo, not to be confused with the DRC in this case, the third deterioration there. And Pakistan has seen significant amounts of terrorism over the last couple of years. In fact, we produced another report called the Global Terrorism Index, and they've been the country most impacted by terrorism for the second consecutive year. So panning out, this is kind of sort of the results of the Global Peace Index. This is the picture of peacefulness, if you will. Now, it's comparative. It's not absolute. So all it does is it compare countries. There's 60 countries here that are in green that would be considered high levels of peacefulness compared to the countries with low levels of peacefulness. But, again, for comparison, take Gambia, which is this country here. Very high peaceful country, but still has, twice as many homicides as the global average, just to give you an example. The MENA region has been for quite some time the least peaceful region in the Global Peace Index. We're going to be delving into that a tiny bit more with all of the colleagues that are accompanying us. In summary, one of the key drivers of this deterioration in peacefulness has been the increase in conflict around the world. Almost 200,000 deaths, as you can see here. 20 countries recorded over 1,000 deaths. This is the most since the inception of the Global Peace Index. One of the things that always strikes me, particularly in the case of Russia and Ukraine, for example, is that, we hear on the news, 20 people got, killed by a drone strike yesterday in X part of Ukraine or alternatively in Russia. But of course, the military deaths are often not disclosed. They're estimated. In fact, I think from memory, we estimate between 70 and 80,000, deaths from Ukrainian soldiers just last year. So the number of deaths coming out of some of these conflicts is very, very severe. And whereas it's confidential in the Ukraine and Russia, in other conflicts around the world, it's just simply massively underreported, such as, for example, the case of Sudan. Okay. I realize I'm taking a lot of time here, but maybe a couple of things just to highlight and to best position our speakers to contribute to this. This increase in conflict comes in tandem with a big increase in what we call internationalized conflicts. These are conflicts, let's take Sudan, for example, that involve many, many actors beyond the actors directly participating in conflict, right? In this case, the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan and the Sudanese armed forces. You have the interests of the UAE, you have the interests of Ethiopia, of Egypt, you have the interests of Yemen and the Houthis, you have Eritrea, you have Somalia, you have Saudi Arabia. And that's just one example of one war, essentially, that involves between 20 and 30 different countries participating or supporting different actors in one way. In conjunction, that's making war and conflict significantly more difficult to resolve. The amount of peace agreements has been cut down by significantly. The amount of overwhelming victories, right, of clear victories, has reduced significantly around the world as well. what that has led to is essentially the increase of these kind of sort of green areas here, which is latent conflict around the world, right? This is the kind of conflict that is out there that may not be causing massive amounts of deaths today, but tomorrow can very easily flare up into something absolutely massive. All of this comes in this sense of a more fragmented world. This is not ours, this is from the Geopolitical Fragmentation Index, but it's a very nice illustrative piece. This is, geopolitical fragmentation, looking at trade, finance, mobility, political aspects. This is the Cold War, essentially, right? All the way from whenever it started until the 1990s, essentially. We're talking about dominance of two superpowers here for the most part. This is what is no doubt going to be referred to as the global age of globalization in future. And since, mid 2010s, right, between 2005 2010, massive increase in fragmentation. Obviously, technology, I think, has had a significant impact there in many, many ways. The lack of inclusivity, perhaps, of this globalization, which is very much Western-led, probably had implications as well. But broadly, what we're looking at today is a significantly more fragmented world. And part of that is that the geopolitical landscape is changing significantly. We do our own estimates and calculations of geopolitical power. The US and China are essentially the two superpowers around the world today. There are a number of great powers as well, largely the European powers, and Russia and India. You have middle powers and emerging powers. You can see them identified here in the various colors. The influence of both China and the US over all the world seems to be plateauing using some of these metrics. So we look at military power, we look at economic power, and then we look at overall levels of influence. And although the US obviously has significant influence, so essentially anything in blue in this global map, and China is largely influential in the red areas, it's very contested in the purple areas, and increasingly less so. Similarly with great powers, right? This is the share of world GDP from some of the great, powers of years gone by, which is essentially reduced by 50% on average over the last 20, 30 years. And in contrast, you have this large increase in the influence and power of middle powers and emerging powers as well. So, for example, established middle powers, Australia, Canada, South Korea, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, right? These are ones that would have sort of a broader, liberal alignment. But then you have the UAE, Indonesia, Turkey, Poland, Mexico, Israel, that are significantly more independent. And increasingly, these countries are kind of really picking kind of what interests them and, can be supportive of either US policy or alternatively Chinese policy or any other, or simply carving their own path. And increasingly emerging powers as well. So the likes of Nigeria, South Africa, Argentina, Qatar, Norway, Thailand, all of these aspiring to be middle powers in many, many ways. So we're talking about massive changes in the geopolitical landscape. I'd be remiss if I didn't close with the economic impact of war. We are the Institute for Economics and Peace, after all. We did this estimate specific to the war in Iran, but some of the main measures obviously can be used. We talked about the current economic cost of violence being $21.8 trillion. That's over 10% of the world's GDP, essentially about $2,600 per person around the world. But this puts it in the context of a single war. So if you have a look at this particular chart here, GFC stands for the global financial crisis, right? That saw a reduction in overall global GDP of 3.5%. COVID-19 had a very similar impact. And as you can see here, the Ukraine war in the very beginning of it had a pretty significant global impact as well. Very similar to what we would see if the Iran war had continued in full force until today, which is scenario 3, what you can see here. This scenario here is essentially all of the damage that had already been done, about $180 billion, and this was by April 2026. So no doubt there's been significantly more cost to the war since. And this at the time in early June was our scenario 2, which is essentially, luckily, what has kind of happened, right? This on again, off again sort of stalemate, if you will. The difference between this and this is about $2.2 trillion, which is in many ways, the value of diplomacy, right? The ability to be able to get a peace agreement in place can be significant when it comes to saving money, when it comes to avoiding the broader economic impact of the war. So I realize I touched on a whole bunch of stuff, and perhaps too much. There's a lot more in the index, of course. So I'd like to end it there. I'd like to bring in our 3 speakers who I think can really complement some of these key findings with core policy aspects, particularly with regards to US policy, Iran policy, and broader global peace building and conflict prevention policy as well. I'd love to be able to start with Dr. Benjamin Rad. And I was looking at your bio, Benjamin, and it talks in part of it that you talk about that you design immersive simulations and strategic learning tools for governments and academia to be able to essentially develop policy in what is increasingly becoming a very difficult world. I mean, we took our best stab here at kind of, building scenarios for the Iran war. Is that becoming more difficult? Is it becoming less difficult? How are you managing in this kind of sort of broader, conflict and geopolitical situation we're living through?
Yeah, great question. The challenge is that the diplomatic tools and the customs and traditions that we've accumulated over the decades, how to address conflict, how to resolve differences between states, how to, end wars or not get into them to begin with, all of those have sort of gone out the window. And the large result of this is basically the rise in the asymmetric capability of one side versus the other. So, for example, what we're seeing, let's say with the US, Iran, and Israel conflict, right? You have a clearly dominant power in the United States, and of course, Israel aligned with it. And yet we saw Iran effectively drive the war into a stalemate. I mean, and the question often asked is, how does that happen? And if we were to sort of simulate this, right? The challenge is not just that you have democratic states going against non-democratic regimes, but you also have the increasing use of non-traditional methods of warfare. We're talking about specifically drones. We're talking about cyber attacks. And also what's increasingly happening is in a more polarized world, we're finding that states or non-state actors that are part of a conflict are able to tap into a social network that reaches the enemy country's domestic population and able to shape public opinion and therefore able to impact the direction that policy takes and diplomacy takes. So we've seen this work very effectively with Iran. We see it as part of sort of a linkage strategy. This is something that first emerged, was talked about at the end of, towards the end of the Vietnam War with Nixon, where he attempted to link the end of the Vietnam War with linking it with Russia and China. And so we're seeing Iran and other sort of smaller states or non-state actors use these same tactics. And these are very difficult things to predict and to simulate because we simply don't always know which way they go. And in many of the war games that I've designed, what I've found oftentimes is that a group of provocateurs or trolls sitting in a bar somewhere are able to wreak havoc against a government that is otherwise, able to conduct a war on a military level, but can't do so, let's say, on a broad social network level. And I don't want to play up the power of these networks, but they're very effective at shaping public opinion. And this is somewhere where the practice has not caught up yet, and where I find that we tend to be behind. When I say we, I'm talking about those that are in the dominant powers, emerging powers that are seeking to end these conflicts.
Yeah, I think that's extremely insightful. I mean, for a couple of reasons, because it really begs that question. When we see, thinking back to that graph that we had on when some of this fragmentation started, and obviously the advent of technology, right, the iPhone in 2010 and all of that kind of sort of brought, you really do kind of sort of see in many ways how social media and these broader forms of technologies have been and are today used in that way. I'm sure that the very successful Lego campaign of Iran, for example, comes to mind of one of those, right? But I mean, also, just harking back to some of our additional work, especially with regards to terrorism and terrorist groups, those same things are being leveraged in exactly the same way, not from a national perspective, but just from a very small group perspective. And that asymmetric element that you touched on, I agree, is becoming significantly more important. In fact, I wonder if you could touch on it a tiny bit more, Benjamin, because we've got this piece in the Global Peace Index this year, which talks about AI capabilities, right, and drones, and kind of sort of reducing the kill chain compression, right? But just the fact that you have these commercial drones, and Iran is a typical example of that are really, driving that asymmetry in many ways as well. Could you delve into that a tiny bit more?
Yeah, and then we see it both in the Iranian conflict and also in the Ukraine theater. And essentially, it's where you have the ability of a smaller, relatively weaker military power is able to bring about a stalemate. Even one would argue victory, depending on how you want to define it, not through military means. They don't have to win; they just have to disrupt. They have to cause enough disruption to destabilize a broader global system that relies on trade routes, supply chains, and a whole host of other things. And that is what we found is that is where these asymmetric capabilities, these disproportionate ability to bring things to a screeching halt and to expose weaknesses between trading partners, between allies, between trading blocks, things of that nature. This is relatively new, at least in the modern age. We haven't seen it done in this way. And I think it's what made these two particular conflicts particularly interesting. And, just to touch on Ukraine for a moment, I mean, we've seen now in the last few weeks, Ukraine's ability to reach deep into Russian territory, targeting Russian energy assets and sectors in ways that were inconceivable, presumably to Putin himself. And that this has effectively kept Ukraine in the game, if you will. And we saw similar measures taken with the Islamic Republic and their decision to launch these Shahid drones, these kamikaze drones against Gulf states, against Arab states, against targets that were meant not to defeat the United States, but to undermine the trade and economic stability that serves as the foundation for that part of the world. And in doing so, they're able to really pull out victory from the jaws of defeat, which is, what it looked like it was headed for them in the first few days of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, if you don't mind, Paul, I'd love to be able to pull you into this because, I mean, I think it's, at least it's pretty clear in my mind, and I'm hoping yours too, that this was definitely a wake-up call for the US in many ways. I mean, not that there is necessarily anything in that endangers the United States from a military or a safety perspective, at least not in the short term, but certainly a wake-up call in terms of things not happening as expected, right? Especially given the success of, for example, the air quote success of the raid in Venezuela, for example, which probably emboldened in many ways the decision with regards to Iran. What changes is that going to have from or should have from a US policy perspective, in your view?
Well, thanks very much. It's a great question, and I think we're still in the process of trying to figure out the real implications of this. Because on the one hand, people have pointed to how the threshold of violence, the willingness to engage in violent means, has declined as a result of access or dissemination of technology such as drones around the world, which is making people less inhibited about using force. And something that your report did not pick up, which I think has been just extraordinary, is the willingness of states now to engage in violence against each other's cities. Just in 2026 alone, 13 capital cities, by my calculation, maybe I'm not getting them all, have been attacked by state actors. I can go through them: Tehran, Tel Aviv, Beirut, Baghdad, Manama, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Doha, Kiev, Moscow, Caracas, Kabul, Islamabad, all been attacked. That was unthinkable several years ago. And it's obviously the access to drones, the access to long-range missile systems. But on the other hand, and this is the perversity, I think, of this, or maybe the silver lining, if that's the right word. And I think Benjamin was kind of heading in this direction, that it's the fact that aggressor states cannot guarantee their political or fulfill their political objectives easily or cheaply as they once thought. Because of this diffusion, the fact that drones and missiles can create incredible levels of disruption, economic dislocation, and so on in return is creating a kind of, in a way, a new equilibrium of deterrence, in which I think states who have overwhelming military power will have to recalibrate their ability to actually achieve their military objectives because of the high levels of costs that typically follow, and the fact it's just difficult to reimpose your political will on people when they have access to cheap, distributed, decentralized military capabilities that can essentially establish what's a friend of mine called mutually assured disruption.
Mm.
And so in a way, this may create a new equilibrium of deterrence in certain regional contexts, which might bring down the level of interstate or internationalized violence in the long term. Now, that's a kind of hopeful byproduct of this development. But in the meantime, as your report says, and you said, Alex, we're going through incredible levels of turbulence, very high levels of conflict and battle deaths, not seen in probably 80 years. But in the future, we may, as I say, see some equilibrium develop here that might actually bring down the level of interstate or internationalized conflict or move it in a different direction.
Yeah, you've opened up a whole other can of worms there, actually, Paul, in many ways, that what I'd like to do is actually put on hold for the second part of the conversation.
Right.
You talked about less inhibited in the use of force. And then there's this more national aspect of the normalization of violence and normalization of political violence as well, especially, for example, in the United States, which has been one of the core drivers of its deterioration in peacefulness. That's one aspect. And then you talked about this new equilibrium, which I think is tremendously, tremendously interesting. And perhaps, Benjamin, we can ask you to comment in terms of your prediction, whether you would concur or disagree with that. But it also begs the question, Paul, in terms of, say, the United Nations, for example, right? As yes, there may be a certain equilibrium there, but also it's becoming increasingly evident that a lot of countries are becoming more emboldened. And you just shared a few examples of that, of making a move, for lack of a better word, in their national interest. So yeah, I'd love to be able to return to that. But because we started on US and Iran, I'd love to be able to hand over to Alex on this. Alex, you grew up were born and grew up in Tehran. You're an expert on everything related to the region. I mean, just yesterday, and in fact, it's ongoing, there's the funeral of the Supreme Leader. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff that's on display, but it's very, very clear that there was a underestimation of the capacity of Iran, even considering this asymmetry of warfare in many, many ways. But there's also significant risks. There was already instability in Iran in the years prior. Has that increased? Has that decreased? What's the future of Iran in many ways? Obviously, stability within Iran is massively impacted. And what's going to be the outcome? Is the outcome going to be a stronger Iran internally, or alternatively a more fragmented one? And what could that lead to?
Thank you. Michael, let me just, before I answer your question, something that jumped at me when I read your report, specifically on Iran, which is my primary focus. And it was the reports, and I thought very interesting and potentially very consequential message that Iran as a challenge for the United States, the world, if you will, is no longer a case about its nuclear program or number of centrifuges it has or to what level it enriches uranium. It is its ability, what you, I think, in the report call systematic ability to hurt the global economy. That's what the challenge is. So, the International Atomic Energy Agency will become marginalized. At best, they're going to be secondary tools that can be part of a much bigger process than was the case before this war was launched by US and Israel. It's no longer going to be about the nuclear program or the missiles or the proxies. Essentially, what you need to solve the problem of the Iranian regime as a challenge is something that looks like a grand bargain. And that is a much heavier lift. And certainly sitting here in Washington, D.C., I don't see that intellectual debate taking place. What does a grand bargain look like with Iran? Because it can't be just limited to the issue of its nuclear program, even though that's what we're talking about at best case scenario if this ceasefire, which I'll turn to in a second, holds. Um, the Iranians over the last 20 years have spent so much time trying to track the asymmetric military power of Iran through its proxies, whether it's in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, so on. It turned out that was not really of much use to Iran at all. What they had, and the United States reminding them of that tool, is the asymmetric economic warfare that they can wage because geography means they're sitting just north of trillions of dollars of sovereign wealth and all sorts of very expensive infrastructure to their south in the Gulf countries, where you have a vested Western commercial interest. So in one of his last speeches before he was killed by the Israelis on the 28th of February, Ali Khamenei came out very specifically and said the next war will be a regional war because the Iranians had been expecting this round of war since the 12-day war of last summer. So the fact that they were attacked again wasn't a surprise to them. And he had said, if you come after us again, it will be a response that will take your friends with us. And that's exactly what they did. So, hitting UAE, hitting Qatar, hitting Kuwait, none of that should have surprised anybody because the Iranians had announced it. And in fact, you can say closing the Strait of Hormuz has been an Iranian policy on the table going back to the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. Nobody should have been surprised. The Iranians were probably the most surprised in how much of a control they actually can exercise over this body of water called the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that takes me to where we are in terms of the ceasefire. Look, it's very frail. The grand bargain discussion that I think is ultimately the only solution here is not being discussed in Washington, but nor is it being discussed in Tehran. In fact, I was just before I came on looking at footage from Tehran where the Iranian foreign minister was being stoned and called names as a compromiser because he dares to sit down and talk to the Americans. So politics in Tehran is hardly any friendlier, and they're certainly not in a place where we can say they're united behind the idea of a grand bargain as a way of assuring that war doesn't break out again. I don't know, Michael, I don't want to talk too much, but I don't know where we're going to go. But here's my best case scenario. You have the ceasefire held for not 60 days. Anybody who expects an agreement in 60 days is engaging in wishful thinking, but many more months after that, where they preserve the peace and they start really seriously committing themselves politically if they can, if the politics in Washington and Tehran allow for it, and perhaps the rest of the world has a say here because the rest of the world experienced what it means for them if there is war in Gulf, to sort of push, prod, and get US, Iran to go in that direction of, as I said, a grand bargain. Because again, just going back to your report, it's not about centrifuges, Iran's nuclear program anymore. And Iran that decides to hurt everybody has discovered they can hurt a lot of countries, not just the Gulf, but a lot of countries, faraway lands, through what the rest of the world depends on as of today from the Gulf. So that to me really is a big message that I picked up from this report of yours. But by the way, congratulations! It's wonderful reading.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. I think you touched on a number of things. I mean, number one, the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz and the impact that that has. Essentially, at the end of it, just with speedboats, right, and still being capable of having that strength, which I think is significant, and I agree is a very, very strong bargaining chip. Indeed, you talked about the grand bargaining, and it reminded me of some of the work in the report this year about this increased fragmentation and the rise of the emerging and the middle powers, and the fact that potentially there are also much broader interests in play that are also going to make complexify issues in ways that wouldn't have been an issue before. I mean, I always go back to the peace agreement, the U.S. peace agreement with the Taliban in Afghanistan, not including the Afghani government at the time, and where that led us. So it does beg the question as to whether there is a holistic enough kind of sort of grand bargain that will be considered when it is considered. And then the other thing you kind of alluded to, and perhaps gives me an excuse to go back to Benjamin after we've had a chance to touch on the questions in the index, is what increasingly is being talked about as complexity theory, right? Which is, there's a whole lot of emergence here. There's just a whole lot of stuff that happens that is extremely difficult to navigate. It's almost like quantum theory, right, in a way. But it's logical, but it goes beyond many ways. So, for example, right, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, and obviously the impact that has on oil supply. Well, how quickly is that going to drive now the transition from fossil fuels over time? And what is going to be the knock-on implication of that? What is going to be the knock-on implication in terms of fertilizers in developing countries? We've seen a significant impact in those countries. How is that going to change the dynamics in places like Sudan, right, which is currently the RSF, for example, Rapid Support Forces, currently being supported by the UAE, who is now being distracted by the Iran war. And what are the implications regionally there? And could that generate additional conflict? So lots of questions, more questions than answers, unfortunately. Thank you very much for jumping into the Q&A, Nassim and Donna. And we definitely invite everyone else joining us to please don't hold back. Put your questions in. And I'm confident that my colleagues here can see the questions coming through as well. And I'd encourage you to jump in with your thoughts. Nassim asks, what does the Global Peace Index consistently fail to measure? Not because the data doesn't exist, but because our understanding of peace hasn't yet caught up with how the world has changed. Probably with regards to the questions, our definition of peacefulness in the Global Peace Index is relatively simple: absence of violence or fear of violence. So if you can measure the fear of violence, if you can measure violence, you can measure the opposite. That is our baseline definition. We often also talk about positive peace, which we see as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that drive these improvements in peacefulness. We look at that statistically. So we look at socioeconomic, developmental aspects, right? Health, education, research in, investment in research and development, acceptance of the rights of others, gender equity, a whole bunch of factors contribute to these improvements in peacefulness over time. One of the things that has often struck me is that geopolitical components in particular don't really feature that much in that underlying fabric. We talk about well-functioning government, we talk about good relations with neighbors, we talk about low levels of corruption, we talk about a sound business environment. These are internal measures for countries. Geopolitical aspects tend to mess with all of that. So I don't think that we really analytically have our head around the geopolitical components, and perhaps it's because some of this, this extra layer of complexity arises from that. Donna also says, building on that point regarding asymmetrical shifts, how do these gray zone dynamics fundamentally reshape future strategic planning for an established power like the United States? Furthermore, as state-centric frameworks strain, what viable role remains for multilateral organizations like the UN that lack formal policing powers to maintain collective security? And this brings me back to Paul's prior comments, right, on whether this is going to create sort of a natural equilibrium that's going to be self-sustaining, or whether what we need is, a new form of multilateralism, one that's going to have, more teeth, or alternatively operate in ways that it hasn't operated before. I'd love to go back to Benjamin at this point because Benjamin, I'm sure you've got lots to jump on. It would be great to touch on your thoughts on the UN. I know that we're on the West Coast for the most part here. We don't talk about the UN very often. They have upcoming election of the Secretary General of there. What should be on their docket? What should be on their to-do list?
I would think one of the central issues that they should focus on is the reconstruction of Gaza. I think from there and what we've seen from the October 7, 2023 conflict that started between Israel and Hamas, and what's sort of spilled over from there is again remains a huge source of instability in the region. I think to take the air out of what is a lot of the motivation used by disruptors in the region, state and non-state actors, to really foment instability and unrest. One of the core components of this is really helping to bring that conflict, not necessarily to an end, I don't think we're there, but at least stabilizing it and at least providing a pathway towards something better for the Palestinian people, for the Israelis as well. And I think really for the UN to take the lead on that, beginning by reforming any UN institutions, whether it's UNRWA, whether it's other agencies that have, directly or indirectly been linked to non-state actors who've been, source of the instability. Regardless of how this is done, I would like to see the UN take a stronger, more central role in really helping to improve the quality of life for the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, and to start there before they take on any other projects in the region, including the situation with Iran.
Can I very quickly jump in?
Go ahead, Alex.
Very quickly, just want to share with you, I was just at the Jeju Forum in South Korea, where Ban Ki-moon was basically there just promoting one of the six next likely heads of the United Nations. And he was literally pleading with one country specifically, United States, which has left so many UN related agencies, dozens, I don't remember exact number of agencies linked to the UN that US under the Trump administration has left. It was literally pleading to the United States specifically in terms of coming back. So my point is, if there's one way UN is going to matter in any significant way, it cannot be without the United States. Maybe at some point in the future, but it's a political issue here in the United States, and I don't know where the Republicans or Democrats are on this question, but that's what the world is hoping to see at least.
And
Yeah.
And Michael, to come back to something else also, is, increasingly, what I look at is I don't think democracies scale very well. What do I mean by this? I think as populations increase, as GDP of democratic nations increase, and we start to see domestic fragmentation, we start to see increasing domestic polarization, this makes it difficult for a country like the United States that is so central, as Alex noted, to anything that multinational organizations do. It makes it difficult for the United States to really rally around one particular approach and policy. I mean, we don't know every 2 years or 4 years, the winds of change in the United States can shift from one way to the other. We simply don't know. It's unpredictable, and the electorate is not predictable necessarily, and we don't know who the next Trump-like figure could be on either side. And this is a challenge that authoritarian and non-democratic states really don't have to worry about as much. They're not susceptible. They're not vulnerable in that way to sort of the whims of the public. And this makes it harder for these larger democratic states, these larger democratic powers, to, I think, play a constructive role. And we saw maybe the peak of that in the 90s, immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and it's increasingly been fragmented and harder. And I think as some of your charts showed that as well. So this is something that I look to, and I look here in the United States, for instance, and I see where is the political will taken by any leaders and emerging leaders that we don't yet know of, who are capable of really playing the positive, constructive role that Alex suggested, and that we'd like to see the United States do in supporting, the United Nations or other multinational, international efforts to bring about peace. That's what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And this gives me permission to be able to go back to Paul in many ways and his original comments about kind of natural equilibrium and the normalization of violence, perhaps leveraging another question that came in from James Lee, that says, when you say the world is more fragmented, what does that mean? In what sense is a more fragmented world a bad thing? I mean, I think that that's a very insightful question, and I don't think it necessarily is. If anything, it's just it's what we're highlighting here in many ways is the change that we are going through. As to whether that's going to lead to better things or worse things, I think the jury is out. Analytically, from a conflict perspective, look, we're seeing these two things broadly happen in parallel. Whether they both originate from the same thing, or alternatively both work together, well, that is part of the studies that remain to be done. We are seeing this increase in conflict around the world. How much that is due to the fragmentation is kind of sort of the open question. At the moment, I'd like to be optimistic. It's difficult with the metrics that we're seeing. Paul, back to you on this aspect of, because it's extremely interesting, right? This natural stalemate. You have these states, including the United States, that are increasingly happy with being entirely transactional and self-interested. And why is that? Why is that a bad thing? I mean, that could be a good thing for all we know, right?
Well, in a world that doesn't have what is often known as collective good problems, where there are common concerns that can only be addressed through collective action, through international cooperation, yes, a transactional approach would work fine. But the problem is that we need these global institutions and regional institutions, not just to facilitate negotiation around these common problems, but also to help implement them. And part of the problem is that we have a U.S. administration that kind of believes in what I would call kind of drive-by diplomacy, that somehow they think they can introduce a peace agreement and there's a truce, armistice, and then they're free and clear of the problem. When you need institutions like the UN and others to actually ensure that there is implementation of what is agreed. And this is the vital sort of hidden importance of many of these organizations, not just helping to foster cooperation in advance of or to head off conflict, but also to manage it and implement peace agreements when they occur. You mentioned, Alex, that there is going to be a new Secretary General in the fall, and I think this is going to be a very important juncture for the UN, arguably even make or break. And it will come down a great deal to the level of US commitment to the new Secretary General. But it will also require the UN to take a very clear-eyed and realistic view of what it can do and how it should continue to do its business in the world. And business as usual as in the past is just not going to be possible. And this is going to be a moment of great opportunity, but also potentially a moment of great peril for the UN, that if they can't adapt, that if they are not seen to be moving with the times and having as I say, a clear-eyed view of the challenges and what they can do, then they're going to become increasingly marginalized and irrelevant. And so I would say this coming year and the early part of next year is going to be extremely important for the UN. And whoever comes into the White House in January 2029 and their general attitude to the UN will be also extremely important for the reasons Alex and Benjamin laid out. The UN cannot function without an active, engaged United States, as well as an active, engaged China or India and EU. it requires high-level support from the major powers in the world, major actors in the world, to give it legitimacy, to give it efficacy through funding and other things. And unless that's forthcoming, we could enter a much darker world in the coming years than we've known in the recent past. So this is a critical moment that we're facing in the next 18 months, 2 years, I would say.
I'd love to be able to open it up to Alex. We do have a question coming in from Abungo, which we'll touch on immediately after that, noting that we have about 8 minutes left in the conversation. Alex, with regards to the UN and multilateralism more broadly, I mean, I'm based in New York, and I spent quite a time at the United Nations. We produced another report called the Multilateralism Index, which kind of sort of indicates that over the effectiveness of multilateralism has, perhaps unsurprisingly, significantly decreased. And it's always struck me in so many conversations that I hear at the UN that still today this, call it a colonialist view, if you will, this idea that we all think the same. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to be able to create the new kind of institutions without understanding that different societies, different cultures think in extremely, extremely different ways. Think the US, China, for example, or alternatively, Islamic countries such as Iran. I'd love to for you to be able to kind of sort of jump into that specifically. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things with regards to the Iran war is the amount of sympathy that Iran has engendered versus the United States, given the way that it has happened, and potentially sympathy that Iran wouldn't have found in other places otherwise. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, Michael, look, you're right. Iran did, from what I can tell, receive a lot of sympathy, certainly in the global south, but by and large around the world, because, most people took the view that this was a war of choice. The United States and Israel didn't have to attack Iran to deal with its nuclear program. So that is, I think, it's hard to deny that reality happened. But to the issue of the future of United Nations, should we see it as, depending on where you come from in terms of your historical legacy, if you are a former colony, do you take one view? If you are a Western state, you take a different view. That's not going to help us go forward in terms of a solution. I mean, you want an empowered, and I speak as someone who thinks actually multilateralism is a good thing. And you want to empower that agency, in this case, the United Nations, to do what it's supposed to do. I mean, you went without the empowerment, but its financial, political mandate is not worth much, frankly. So that's the thing. It comes down to the nation states, whether they're willing to invest in it. Certainly, the United States has walked away from that. But maybe the United States will go back for its own selfish reasons to think actually UN is not a bad thing, even for American interest. But I would just say one thing, and I agree with Benjamin and Paul in terms of the importance of UN. But I will also say this, zooming quickly on Middle East. The Middle East doesn't have to wait for the United Nations to get its mandate fully, charged up before the region of the Middle East can move on to engage in conflict resolution. Some of the conflicts in the Middle East are harder to achieve than others. I mean, the situation in Gaza is extremely hard because it involves Israel, which means it involves the United States, harder to achieve. But take the conflict or post-conflict Syria. We saw the Syrian war become one of tit for tat. There would have been no 14-year Syrian civil war had a lot of the states in the region, to your point about internationalization of conflict, a lot of Middle Eastern states started investing in that conflict. They picked sides. It fueled that civil war. Today, we have the opposite reality. Today, the Gulf countries are not competing with one another. In fact, they're staying away from one another where they're investing in commercial opportunities in Syria. That's the kind of situation where you have an entire region, in this case, the Middle East, perhaps, I maybe even hopeful, walking away from that zero-sum mentality and says, you know what, I don't have to have everything. I can share with it. If I'm Saudi Arabia, I can share with UAE, I can share with Qatar. But it comes to some of these commercial contracts. So it starts much smaller on a regional level, but it might be a good precedent. And in this case, in the Middle East, would be good development to see, as we're seeing right now, but hopefully it grows into something bigger in terms of a positive new reality.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I think that harks back again to this idea of a potential new equilibrium coming out of all of the conflict and instability that we're seeing today. I'm going to ask us to do something relatively difficult, which is to combine our answers to questions and our final thoughts in one, starting with, in this case, myself, if you don't mind, just because we have the question coming in from Abungo. The question is, what do we think about elected leaders who automatically become military chiefs, etc., heading wars from the front line? What about a United Nations army that can get in to protect civilians during unjust or any type of military persecution? As a strategic concept to drive peace. Perhaps just a couple of thoughts on that. The idea of that has been around for quite some time. It is very much a hot potato. There have been, relatively few successes on the UN peacekeeping front. Some of them have been absolutely pivotal and have saved thousands of lives. Some of them have indirectly led to thousands of deaths. There was a policy a few years back which on paper looked absolutely fantastic, the responsibility to protect, which ended up in the Libyan war. Which then drove not only significant conflict deaths in Libya, but then broader instability throughout the Sahel region, including a lot of the Islamic insurgencies from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda insurgencies that we are seeing there, leading again to thousands of deaths, and now feeding weapons into places like Sudan, South Sudan, even as far right as Somalia, for example. So I think it's something that there's relatively little appetite for. One of the things that we broadly see with regards to dictatorships around the world is that the people who are very good at military campaigns and even ensuring a very superficial level of security are pretty bad when it comes to standard governance and the provision of public services. So that doesn't lead to these levels of positive peace that then create these, stable levels of peacefulness within a society, which is why we see countries trapped in eternal coups, for example. Benjamin, I'd love to be able to hand over to you for some final thoughts, followed by Paul and Alex, after which I'll quickly close us out.
I was looking at Abungo's question, and I think what comes to mind is, given that we're celebrating 250 years of the founding of the U.S. Republic, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 famously wrote when talking about the weakness of the judicial branch, that it is the weakest branch of government because it has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. And I think that as we look to international institutions and organizations like the UN to be able to play a role, because at this point, it's difficult to rely on the great powers or the intermediate powers to take that initiative. Until there is any agency or institution that has both force and will, and not just judgment, I think it's difficult to envision a role for them going forward. And especially as, again, to go back to the point of domestic populations becoming more fragmented and these larger states dealing with their own domestic instability that is sort of under the surface, that makes it harder to come up with a cohesive policy that would bring about peace. So as we look to international groups to be able to take on that challenge, I think until they are equipped with the proper force and demonstrate the will to use that force, whatever that force may look like, it's hard to see how they can play a constructive role moving forward beyond what we've already seen.
Thank you, Benjamin. Paul?
So just a final few words. I think what has happened over the last few years and this new trend of conflict, I think just underscores the need for us to try to be a little more forward thinking, a little more forward acting, to try to shape the environment in ways that lessen the risk of conflict. We're moving in a far too reactive, short-term fashion. We've got to sort of reconceptualize what we mean about peace building going forward, what it entails, the importance of economic development, trade. These are some of the basic pillars of long-term peace, and we're getting away from that as a result of this greater fragmentation that your report reflects, and we need to reconceptualize peace, I think, and what it entails, and we need to encourage a much broader involvement of the major powers in that process. It can't just rest on the US being the principal guarantor of global security. China has to step up, the EU has to step up, India and others, and all play their part. So for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a critical moment this next 2 or 3 years, I think, in future trends in peace and conflict around the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Alex.
Yeah, very quickly, Michael. I mean, look, Donald Trump gets a lot of criticism for having started this war that really didn't have to start. But you have to give him credit for the fact that he's also very quickly decided he wasn't going to stay in this war for 20 years the way U.S. stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years. He's trying to wrap things up, and I think that goes to show you perhaps one lesson we learned from the this latest conflict in the Middle East with Iran, U.S. and Israel. The Iranians deliberately bringing the Gulf states into it was really to say to the world, if we're going to hurt, everybody else is going to hurt. And I think they made their point, and I think that has been taken seriously. But the other thing that the Iranians wanted to do was to force the Gulf countries who have very close ties to the United States to pick up the phone and tell the American president to stop the war. And to a great extent, that has also been a factor here. My bigger point is commercial interest. We're talking about cheap drones taking large economies hostage. Paul was talking about 13 capitals being hit. Warfare today, if you want to compare to what's happening with the Iran war to, for example, what happened in Afghanistan. For 20 years, there was a war in Afghanistan. The rest of the world didn't really feel a thing about it. That's not the case anymore. And countries like Iran are going to now do that going forward, which means American businesses are going to be taken hostages if they're in vicinity to conflict. I think that's another aspect of why there might be a new driver to prevent war that can get out of control. Not because people not necessarily against war, they're against being hurt commercially in terms of their pockets. And I think, again, going forward, while we're waiting to see what happens with the UN and big states like China, India, European Union getting their act together, in the meantime, we have much smaller non-state actors with commercial interests who actually might be able to shape the politics of war going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex, and everyone. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone from the Pacific Council. If you are a member, congratulations and thank you for offering us this space to be able to present and discuss this material today. If you're not a member of the Pacific Council, please do become one. My name is Michael Collins. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Economics and Peace. I'm based in New York. My particular email is mcollins@economicsandpeace.org. I'd be extremely happy to put you in touch alternatively with the Pacific Council or any of the speakers that joined us today. Again, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to reconnecting soon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.